You are tuning in to Access Live, a show about raising awareness, what's going on in the community, and to address the issues that impact youth and their families that have serious emotional and behavioral challenges. We are located at the Brookins Building at 1776 East Washington in Urbana, Illinois, and at the downtown location at 202 West Park Street.
Well, what another glorious afternoon in July. Today is July 9th in 2014. I don't even know when it got to be 2014, but they say it is. We have another glorious day. We've had a little bit of rain, which is always good. Everybody's gardens and homes are looking nice as I walk and drive by. Because why? Because beauty is a mental health issue. Because we deserve beauty in our lives, and we are capable of making that. And that is one way that we do self-care. Now, certainly there's been an issue on the tip of everyone's tongue over the past few weeks. We talked about it last week, about the most recent incidents of gun violence in our community, this time, of course, in Garden Hills. Last week, we talked about the march that started at Jericho Missionary Baptist Church and went down Garden Hills Drive. Some people felt very good about it. Other people did not, namely some neighbors. We're certainly talking to them offline and getting their opinions. We invite all of you to give us a call today at 359-9227. We, of course, decided to do a follow-up show this week because there's so much to cover when we're talking about anger, when we're talking about hurt, when we're talking about trauma as it relates to violence taking place in the African American community. Of course, not just here in Champaign-Urbana, but across the state and nation. I'm sure you all heard the news, which isn't news anymore, about the massive gun violence that's taken place in Chicago just over the past week. Of course, a massive amount over the 4th of July holiday weekend. But Access believes we can get a handle on it. If we will truly commit ourselves to the mental health and well-being of African American youth, families, and the larger community, if we'll really commit, if we'll really be serious about building what we've called each week a system of care, that's when all the agencies and organizations that have anything to do with our lives come together and try to act as one, sharing resources, policies, and practices. It is quite doable. For those of you all who get the weekly notice, we said we were going to follow up. So we're going to talk about not just violence, but anger in particular. And then we're going to follow up actually with a 3-part series on that. But we're going to stay focused today on the question of anger, on community violence, on trauma, and what does our community need that it might not even be able to express? What does it need that is quite able to express but others may not be listening to? And what does our community want? So we are so happy to have in the studio again this week for our follow-up Miss Karen Sims, who functions as a coordinator with the Access Initiative. She's in charge of wraparound services and training and technical assistance. So, hey.
Hi, sorry, we had a little interesting situation outside.
Okay.
So I had to sit in my car for a minute.
Uh-oh. Okay, anything worth talking about on the air?
It just is related to the subject.
Okay, so Karen is apologizing for showing up when she did, but she know I got it covered till she can get here.
Yes.
Okay, so you say you pulled up and had to stay by your car for a few minutes.
Inside of my car for a few minutes.
Inside your car for a few minutes. What happened?
So we have our local law enforcement, sort of handling whatever,
So there was an incident right outside the radio
That's
station,
right.
and law enforcement was out there handling it.
Lots.
Wow. I guess it happened after I walked in.
Okay.
Okay, so does lots means a lot of activity on the part of the police?
No. It just was a lot of law enforcement, yeah.
A
with
lot
guns,
of law
Guns
enforcement.
locked and loaded, yeah.
Guns locked and loaded only moments ago.
Yes. So, it's just, I don't know. I'm having a interesting, I know I heard your segue.
Yeah.
And, I just finished having a really interesting email dialogue with my dad about men and violence. And so it just felt like,
And before I got in my car to come over here, I had just had an exchange on Facebook on these questions.
Okay.
There was, many of you all know Vanessa Gibson, who has, of course, left our community but is still a part of it. She's now in New Orleans, and somebody posted. Did you get this in your email?
Probably
you may
not.
haven't.
No,
Okay. Some of you have seen a video that's going around. I believe it was on CNN, and it was talking about suspensions and expulsions. And how, of course, African American students are overrepresented, and in particular talking about suspensions of preschoolers. And so, of course, there is the massive outrage, but Vanessa did a monologue, if you will, on the importance of us not just speaking up on Facebook, but what would it mean to study your school district's handbook on suspensions and expulsions, on student conduct? What would it mean to follow school board meetings? What would it mean if there are policies and practices that you disagree with? How might we spend time together to propose alternate policies and procedures? So our anger and rage may be justified, but we must move to the next step. The question is, once we calm down, what do we want to do about it? And if we believe the people who have been in power are not operating in our interests, what would be the logic in continuing to count on them to develop policies and practices that will actually work for us? What shall we do? And so here we are talking about, so I'm connecting this question of suspensions and expulsions, which often has to do with some kind of spoken or physical violence or sense of harm, and the actual harm that takes place in our community. And here we are in the middle of having this radio show, and literally right outside our door, the police are locked and loaded.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
yes.
a couple of different things. One is I love thinking about sort of the big picture, sort of the macro level, because I do think that there are policies in place, right, that don't fully understand our youth, that aren't responsive to the youth, that name the thing the wrong thing. And when we talk about, go back to what we're talking about, trauma and violence, when you don't name it the right thing, it looks like bad behavior rather than rethinking some of the behaviors that we see as problematic, particularly in young children, but even older children frequently have its roots in trauma.
That's right.
And what we're learning, the conversation I was having with my dad was, he put out a little like blurb, because he does this daily like blog rant thing. Every day you get multiple ones, but he was saying that, we have this uptick in gun violence and we shouldn't be surprised. And he sarcastically said, I blame moms. And my response for the last 2 days is, because supposedly moms help teach you empathy. But the research, and so this is where being research-based, and we're going to go a little heady, says
Y'all
that...
see the ugly look on my face?
So the research actually suggests that where men learn to deal with violence and expressions of violence actually is a male responsibility. And grandiosity, which is, right, people see grandiosity as sort of a negative thing, but healthy expressions of grandiosity are actually taught by men. And when you are doing all of the posturing and gun violence and toting and acting bad and proud, that actually comes from insecurity. So it's unhealthy narcissism, which happens when you don't have dads around.
Okay, narcissism
means really it's an unhealthy expression of grandiosity and self-expression.
Okay, right? So when I was growing up, we used to call that being big-headed.
Right, being
big-headed. Yeah.
It looks big-headed, but really it comes from insecurity.
Absolutely.
So narcissism actually means what's underneath when we brush away the posturing and puffing up. Really, you're a paper tiger, because I can just blow on you and you'll fall apart.
Exactly.
Because there's nothing, and you don't have it internally.
So it's really fake.
Right. It's all fake.
It's all
and
fake.
That's why you posture.
It's all posturing.
It's all posture.
Yes.
And that comes from men. So I was like, Dad, right? Dad, like, you can't blame, women can do, we can do nurturing and attachment and relational stuff, which we know helps heal trauma. Yes. But also what helps heal trauma is also the healthy expression of self, the being fully, that's a male thing. And I'm like, so Dad, hey, if we really want to stop this, if we want to stop gun violence, we need men to step up in big ways, but also school systems and districts to understand how important men are in helping regulate that kind of violent behavior.
And we also need men to co-sign what we're trying to do. How we try to hold up our end of the sky instead of being quick to call somebody a sissy or worse. Right? Who is genuinely expressing true empathy, which is a real legitimate human emotion. To co-sign, these are some really good things that women and girls practice, model, and teach. Additionally, here are some things you can count on me for.
That's right. Wonderful. And that men need to see, right, we talk about women, all these are our children, and that generally tends to be conceptualized as a woman's thing, right? Like, all the kids are, but we need men to see all of these young boys as their boys.
Yes.
Right? Imagine, like, again, the way that I learned how to react with men, the way I learned the social norms of the community. Unfortunately, although this is from from an anti-oppression context, men historically have provided and protected, and when men aren't in place, don't see themselves as having agency around providing and protecting, they do crazy things. We see that locally, we see it worldwide. We need men in place, right, to help communities feel safe.
Yes.
Right? Unfortunately, wrong, and different.
Exactly. We need and it makes us as feminists, it makes us sort of queer,
you're right?
But the truth of the matter is the truth
and we know even in the animal kingdom, when men don't feel like they're ruling things, they eat their young. Right? That's what they do. And women can only do so much to modulate that protection. So again, I think when we talk about trauma and reducing community violence, there's a real meaningful way. I was talking to Tracy about this. Every evidence-based practice has a meaningful role to have the community take a leadership role.
Yes.
And a lot of that is men taking leadership roles in communities, right?
Yes.
And supporting the role of women meaningfully in policies, procedures, and practices.
That's right.
But we need to be moving in that direction. Step one, right? Like that's on the ground.
That's right.
That's going to help heal so much.
And again, what we mean by best practice is?
Best practices are research-based. So people have researched, done studies. Generally, there are, depending on how big the pool is, but generally there's a sample size, so they have to research so much stuff. When we look at the research on violence, which is pretty old, they actually a lot of it's based on looking at other studies, like looking at other studies. And when we talk about best practices, I can take a program like Ceasefire, and I can disaggregate. I can pull apart all the threads and say, when I look at the core, it has a this, it has a this, it has a this. And I can look at every evidence-based practice and sort of say, at the core, we do a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and there's some things that are parallel in all of them. And what's beautiful, when we parallel it with the research on trauma, this is what's profound. If we do what we know is best, we actually help heal people.
We do. And the thing that I want to co-sign with you is it's not good enough to have a good idea, right? There, we have this impulse. This seems like the right thing to do, or, oh, I came up with this good idea. Love you. Thank you for thinking of this. We need stuff that we know actually works.
That's right.
Or we need to be willing to submit our good ideas to rigorous examination.
Absolutely.
And be willing to say, oh, after we took a look at it and did it have this quality, and this quality, and we found out it didn't, will we be willing to let it go? Yeah. Or if it turns out to be, whoa, this is on, right? Will we then be willing to fund, sustain it, grow it?
Yes. And when we talk about something like violence, I guess they say this about music. There's probably no new music ever being created, right? So when we're talking about something like, when we're talking about something like violence, and I bet you everybody's good ideas have elements of what we know works. And I think at this point, because it's so crucial, the sense of clearly I have it. It is so crucial, so violent, so important at this time in our lives as a people, as a society, as a culture, that I think we just got to do what we know works.
That's right.
And even if the way that you want to package it so that it feels individualized and personal or whatever, that's great.
Yeah.
But we know if you need 6 things, you got to have those 6 things.
That's right.
And so again, personalize it, individualize it, make it your own, but do the 6 things that we know you need to do.
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Because we can't afford to we can't afford to act like we're going to come up with the most creative idea, because your creative idea probably was done before and tested and vetted. But where you can add it in terms of cultural nuance and community based, do all of that, but add the 6 things.
That's right. No, that's wonderful. And so that's in the notice I sent out this week. I was encouraging our audience to, treat today like a really interactive classroom.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we just did a little teaching and learning on what is best practices. Yeah. And there's also this idea of promising practices that hasn't quite reached the level of best practices, but looks good enough and has enough elements to do it and keep researching it, right?
Well, actually, I want to go back to where the research is around evidence-based practices is really exciting, because what I talked about in terms of looking at what are the key components of a practice is where the research is, because promising practices just means that they don't meet the criteria for being an evidence-based practice.
Not enough research has been done.
And really they're thinking about evidence-based programs, not practices.
Got you.
So generally we're talking about something like, I'm trying to think about a program like mental health first aid, or if we're talking about community violence, there are a bunch of different youth build, right? Like those are programs that have been shown to reduce community violence. They're evidence-based programs.
Right.
But in terms of practices, we use the word, we call it promising practices, but really it's really what we know works in terms of practices are pretty well codified.
Yeah.
Like that. There are programs that aren't codified because they haven't met all the bells and whistles, but the practices, what we know works. We could look at 13 programs or 26 programs, and we can now say those programs all have certain elements.
Yes.
And what we as a community need to do is decide these are the elements that we're going to do, and then we're going to come together collectively to do the things that we know work.
Yes.
Regardless of buying a package program.
Right.
We don't have to buy a package.
Yes.
What we do need to do is make a commitment to the practices.
Okay, and we've got a call. Hello, caller.
How you doing, Imani?
Hey, wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Okay.
When we're talking about mental health problems and stuff in the community, we do have, I'd say, more than other communities, but it comes from how our community has been treated probably the last 30 years when the mental health really took off by the lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, when we see more of the world getting opportunities, and like African Americans and Americans getting a lot of theirs cut back. now that where affirmative action where we don't even get the platform, to have an equal playing field. So a lot of this is caused by other things, or how are we going to deal with that part of it?
Right. So let me make sure I hear what you're saying. So you're saying, while it's true, there is a lot of violence in the African American community, you want to say the root causes of that violence are very much connected to how our society is run as a whole. Who gets jobs, who gets good paying jobs, who gets decent housing, etc. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
And our school districts are, slacking on a lot of things where
Yes.
So
we're not getting the education out of school that we should get. We're not having our communities don't have like community centers, just things that,
so can we
that
talk?
would help the community be more stable.
You're
Okay,
absolutely right.
Karen,
So
go
can
ahead.
we? So you're dead on. So we're going to talk about. We were just talking about evidence-based practices, best practices, and Martel, is it right? Right. I thought I heard the voice. What he's saying about what helps heal and reduce are some things. Every evidence-based practice that deals with community violence has an economic development component. And that economic development, right, this is square one, includes job training, vocational career building. People have to believe that there is opportunity beyond right here and now. There has to be a reason, and that includes a school and community partnership. So you're dead on. And again, we can pull a study after study after study. There's no study that says reducing that jobs and reducing community violence don't go together. So you're on, and it's also key to dealing with people's mental health. Yeah, because when you don't feel like you have hope, and we also know stress, so economic stress, being constantly like not knowing where your next dollar's coming from, we know leads to adverse, right, bad health outcomes and bad mental health outcomes. So your recovery, even if you have a genetic predisposition to something, even if you're born with the tendency to be depressed, you're more likely to be depressed and stay depressed if you don't feel good, if you don't have economic stability.
Right.
So, right, you guys get like, you can't feel good about life, right? It becomes more difficult.
Yeah, so we can't separate those things out. I really appreciate you saying that, Martel, because that's what I heard when we walked down Garden Hills Drive, that poverty is traumatizing.
That's right.
Right? So direct violence is traumatizing, but what's up under it, or the root causes, are what's traumatizing over generations. So we experience what we call racism or impoverishment. Those things are traumatizing. And when the public wants to respond like, what can we do for Garden Hills? Let's just have some more community centers. That's just a small piece, because that still isn't dealing with these deeper issues of structural violence. We're going to have to take a break, Martel, but you really...
Okay, I'll let y'all go.
No, you
You
really helped us open up the discussion, and we'll come back to it right after this break. Thanks, hon. Okay, y'all stay tuned, and we'll be back in a moment.
Access Live can be heard every Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. on WBCP 1580 AM in Champaign-Urbana. You can learn more about the Access Initiative by visiting their website at www.access-initiative2.org.
And we're back. So we want to thank Martel for calling and getting us a little exercise here. We are going to, since we said we were going to be real conscious about this being an interactive classroom setting, so we talked about what evidence-based practices are, or some people say best practices. That means you've got evidence for them, and that's why you try to replicate them. This has been shown to work.
Yes.
And in particular, we want to say, we're not going to pick an evidence-based practice that works well with Eskimos.
Yeah,
Because we don't live amongst Eskimos. So it can't just folks just can't say, oh, we're evidence-based, everybody use us. We have to be particular to who we're trying to work with. So when we say best practices or evidence-based practices, in this context, we're talking about what has been shown to work well amongst African Americans in the black world, so to speak. We also talked about promising practices, which Karen pointed out was more about programs that are promising, but they have to have these elements of the evidence that says, say, these 6 things work, therefore this is the program we designed around these 6 things, for instance. We've also used a number of other terms that we want to take a moment and look at. And as you all know, the Women from SisterNet, coordinated by Dr. Helen Neville, do research for us every week to make sure we've got vocabulary and tips and further resources. So, Karen, we've got here, so what do we mean by community violence? One of the solutions to, when I said earlier I was on the Facebook conversation, it was about discipline, for instance, and I was saying to the folks on the thread that we've just got to think about and make a commitment to doing school differently. And that includes doing discipline differently. And that I had proposed to the Champaign School District and gotten a good response for this zone we're trying to build on the north side of town, that is it possible to operate not in a punishment paradigm? A paradigm is like a worldview, a way of thinking, a way of approaching things, and take it to a more people-centered or human-centered justice approach. So taking a look at restorative justice, restorative circles, etc. So do you want to go through these and say a little about them? So if you can talk about community violence, restorative justice, PTSD, anger and hostility, like from how you use these things in access work. You're working with families, you do wraparound, you're dealing with plans. How do these things come into being? So if you could define them and talk about how we use them in people's life. And she's looking at me like Imani, really? Could you give me a heads up? I'm only doing this because I know you know it's what you do every day. So do your best.
All right. So community violence is sort of, right, it's sort of self-explanatory. It's sort of violence of all shapes, forms, types that happen in the community. And the only thing that separates community violence from like family violence is that it's broader, has a broader impact. It impacts more people. So even that domestic violence instance, and I don't want to minimize that, though can be a community violence issue when people hear and experience it. But normally, right, in the popular culture, when we think about community violence, people are thinking about, right, gang violence or shootings that happen in the community or muggings that happen in the community, things that happen outside of your home that make you feel unsafe in your community, which we know key to healing is feeling like you can move around in your community, be out on your front porch, run and play and go to your park. So community violence, you asked how it impacts our work. So one of the things that we talk about in Access is being asset building. We talk about developmental assets as a framework, and having healthy neighborhoods that you feel attached to actually is a core asset. People forget that. So kids who don't have that actually are missing a core part of what makes them healthy, actualized human beings and reach their full potential. And we also know when we're talking about trauma, particularly kids who've been impacted by early trauma, we call it pre-verbal trauma. We talked about it making a school thing. So traumas that happen before 3, what heals is rhythm, rhyme, and repetition, right? Rhythm, rhyme, and repetition. And a lot of that is like stuff that happens when you play outside. So community violence actually impedes kids who've been impacted by early trauma's ability to heal
because they can't
go outside and play. They can't run, they can't play ball, they can't do all the things they need to do. They can't go to
games games,
all the park, all of that stuff that you do,
that,
riding your skates, all of that
right.
stuff that heals.
Yeah.
You can't get healing because you
Yeah.
can't go to the park and you can't play outside. So community violence has significant long-term
Yes.
lasting impact.
Yes.
Not only just broadly, but like
Yeah.
in the day-to-day in terms of the healing of the brain.
It changes who we are.
That's right.
On a personal level, it can change who kids are when they see it in the home, but as a collective community violence changes who we are and begins to regrettably shape the culture.
That's right.
So then you end up with some kind of indoor culture.
That's right.
Or armed camp culture.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and we
yeah,
talk about
yeah.
all the other health complications with obesity and blah,
Yes.
blah, 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 right? The other thing, and I want to jump around
Yes,
to PTSD.
go to that last,
so
yeah.
imagine if you are living, anybody who's ever been in a situation where you are constantly under stress, and the way our bodies deal with trauma, all those stressors turn, the code word is trauma. And once I continue to put you under stress over and over again, or if the trauma is bad enough, if the stress is bad enough and you happen to not have the skills and protective factors to make it better, you can develop something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which we tend to think about happening to vets.
Right.
But all that means is again, we put you under enough traumatic stress
Yes.
that your sense of being a rubber band,
Yes.
it snapped too much. It's hard for you to come back together. Your rubber band is too loose.
So post just means after. So
the traumatic
after
stress,
the trauma.
Yeah,
Yes.
And so the way that looks like is you tend to have a heightened startled response. So it means that a noise or somebody coming at you, like even the teacher who's lovingly coming to touch you, could trigger a startled response
Yes.
if you've learned that that's a negative response, right? It makes you tend to replay the situation. So even if you're not in it, you'll continue to have fantasies and thoughts. It promotes something called disassociation. So again, what looks like you're checked out, it's a protective measure that comes as a result of dealing with constant trauma. So a lot of the behaviors.
So there's this thing. This is a little cute piece, but makes sense. They say one of the ways that very young babies protect themselves, that we do have a mechanism as young infants that when they're getting stimulated too much or becoming unhappy, they can actually shut off and go to sleep
That's right.
as a defense mechanism. Well, that works in a little baby.
Yeah.
The problem is when we're using those same strategies as youth and adults, they don't work anymore.
Yeah,
That we
right.
need new
That's
strategies.
right. Makes you One of the other
Yes.
things as an adult is hypervigilance. So PTSD looks like it's a syndrome. So that means it's a collection of different signs and symptoms that are a result of how you cope with trauma. And what we know about how that looks, right, is really varied. It's individualized, but we know it means that you're more sensitive to touch, to stimulation, to sounds, and the consequences, if you're not dealt with, are long-term and long-standing. It also impacts the brain. Everything that we're talking about that seems like it's external actually develops your brain. And what we also know about untreated PTSD, and this is SisterNet, right, is it leads to adverse health complications.
Yes.
So it increases your likelihood of having cancer, mental illness, substance abuses, having all kinds of other heart attacks, dying, is untreated PTSD actually kills you.
And not being
can kill you.
Yeah, and not being able to function in settings that count on you to be
That's
functional.
right.
So function at a very low level
That's
in terms of maybe running your home,
Yeah.
functioning at a low level at work, if you can even keep a
That's
job.
right. And for
those kinds of
kids,
things.
PTSD is super important because frequently what looks like, and this is what Access has been, one of the things that we've really learned these few years when we've been trauma informed is what looks like bad behavior frequently is just a trauma response. So that kid who looks like he has ADHD, he or she has ADHD, frequently it's a trauma response, right? It looks like because that hyperstimulation, that being keyed up, if we can deal with that, that's why the ADHD meds don't work for kids who have trauma experiences.
Because that's not what's wrong.
That kid who you're like, oh, he's disengaged, right? He's not paying attention, he's not good at school because he's disengaged. Sometimes when we unpack that, if we deal with what hurts, we free up the dissociation.
Yes.
You can pay attention better
Yes.
when we've dealt with your pain.
But the answer is not that these are excuses,
No,
but
it's-
they're reasons.
Yeah.
So once we define what it really is, then we can work on changing
That's
it.
right.
So
And it's
we don't
not
wanna
about, and the other thing is, and it's also not about getting people into therapy. Because
Mhm.
what heals is people acknowledging the hurt.
Yes.
And people letting you play.
Yes.
And people letting you be. And people giving you some skills. And people relating to you
Yeah.
as a person. So we're not
Yeah,
saying like everything's
not about talk
So I guess
therapy.
I want to say, because
Thank
we're
you.
access and people always are like, oh, if you're talking about trauma, you're talking about therapy.
Yeah.
What heals trauma is frequently, it doesn't always have to be like sitting down talking to somebody.
Mhm.
A lot of that just happens for people acknowledging your
Yes.
pain.
So,
and also giving you some skills that way.
Absolutely. And I tell you, in the context of the African American community, what I think of so much is justice. I tell you,
right.
justice can heal some trauma.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because that's a policy.
Right.
That's a real policy and a practice.
It's a
Absolutely.
big thing. And so sometimes, like people maybe who have been victims, and they want to see maybe their perpetrators caught. They've been robbed at gunpoint, sexually assaulted, etc. One of the ways that we're taught the right way to deal with that is get him and punish him. I want him to spend the rest of his life in jail or whatever. But they might find what they really need in terms of healing is not to know that somebody's going to jail for 25 years to life, but that some justice can happen for them, because I don't know that punishing someone actually heals the soul that's
So
been
funny.
injured.
There's actually and I will share this with you.
Yeah.
I just found a really fascinating journal article. I shared it with Elaine and Mikhail, who do restorative justice, that the way that you heal, that restorative justice actually teaches the skill to help heal the trauma.
Yes.
So we go back to restorative,
speaking of
right?
restorative
Justice.
justice,
Actually, because it's a skill building opportunity, that's a relational way of communicating and engaging, where you hear the whole story,
Yes.
you listen empathically, you develop the skills to stay in relationship, you learn the skills to forgive, right? All of those things. Restorative means repairing, restore the harm,
yeah.
and it's justice meaning that, right, it's fair and equitable. But if you've been hurt, you frequently don't necessarily know the skills
Yeah.
to heal. And
Yeah.
practicing restorative justice
Yeah.
actually helps heal. They say it's the best practice to help heal trauma survivors, and it does something. They've done some work around what it does to the brain. It actually helps redo the wiring of the brain.
And that's real.
And that's real.
That's a physiological change in the brain. We just not talking about, a hug and stuff.
No.
We're talking about how a hug can change the brain.
Change the brain
and how
change the heart.
justice can change
And
the
free
brain
up the heart.
and
The heart.
Beautiful. So we're going to talk some more serious business and heartfelt business right after this break. Stay with us.
Access Live can be heard every Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. on WBCP 1580 AM in Champaign-Urbana. You can learn more about the Access Initiative by visiting their website at www.access-initiative2.org.
I'm your host, Imani Bazzell. In the studio, we have Miss Karen Sims, who serves as the coordinator for wraparound services and training and technical assistance. We are talking about anger and violence in the communities we live in and or care about. We can't do it all in an hour. We didn't even pretend we were going to get there last week, but we've come back today to take it a little further. We want your input. Give us a call at 359-9227. Karen, you were, so you talked about what community violence is. You've talked about what PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is. Not just something that veterans experience, but we can experience. Even young children
That's right.
can and do experience. We've talked a lot about anger and hostility, and while not on the air, have talked about doing specific shows dedicated to the questions of anger and hostility in our relationships and in our community. And then you started talking about restorative justice, which is a different paradigm from the punishment paradigm.
That's right.
When wrong has been done, when people have been hurt, the way we mostly operate is this punishment paradigm. What would happen if we switched and said what we want most is to be restored? Even the law talks about making people whole,
That's
right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's where this question of restorative justice comes in. And some of us are trying to work with the school district to say, can't that be the way that we approach school discipline?
That's right.
Is through the lens of balanced and restorative justice, restorative circles, those other
And
kinds
just also
of,
see
yes.
it, and to see it as a skill, because
Yes,
I felt like
good.
I would be remiss,
Yeah.
like lazy if I we talk about trauma and traumatic events and community violence as creating a trauma without saying that it is never acceptable for kids and adults to live in neighborhoods where there is community violence. However, we know that the more protective factors, the more good stuff, the lesser the impact. And so not everybody who's exposed to community violence ends up with adverse bad
Correct.
problems.
Yes.
You do end up with bad problems, more bad problems, the fewer protective factors, the fewer resiliency factors.
Okay, so name some of those.
Some of those things. So having 2 or more adults who love and care for you, who are not your parents, who are there for you, having a neighborhood that you feel engaged with, learning, loving, and being engaged with schools, and having a teacher who you feel connected to, having policies where you feel like the classroom values you. Believing that it's important to make healthy decisions around violence, so having the skills to reduce violence and conflict. Being involved in positive recreation. That's both physical activities, but also arts-based education. So making sure you're doing not just STEM, but STEAM, right? That's the
Yes.
new, adding the arts
Okay,
into
so say what it is.
So science, technology, I lost my E.
Arts. Engineering.
And math. So making
Yes.
sure that you're balancing out all of those things, but also having activities, having some sort of, however you want to define it, a spiritual community.
Yes.
It doesn't, however you define that, but having a community of practice, super, super important. So putting those things in place for both adults and children, and we
Yes.
can kind of broaden it out,
Yes.
really does. But, at the end of the day, I always tell people, it's amazing how important school is as a protective factor. Because we found, and you can read people's bios, but the research says that the things that help keep kids being resilient, people always are like, oh, it's going to be parents. And parents are super important, but resiliency actually comes from sometimes things outside of your parents.
Absolutely.
And valuing an education and having school feel like a safe place for you is a key protective factor.
It is.
Because that's where you spend, like, as a kid, a lot of your life.
Yes, it's your cushion, right?
Yeah.
It's your protection.
Which is why I think people get all up in arms when school isn't that for our kids.
That's right. And with good reason. I would also say that some people believe the religion of the nuclear family is actually pathological.
Oh,
right?
And there's a lot to, and that's why I said 2 or more adults who are
I was
not
trying to co-sign
who
that.
were not your biological parents are key
Yes.
to your health
Yes.
and wellness, because you need the village.
You need the village.
Kids
And
were
so,
never
yes.
meant to be raised in a nuclear
And
family.
that's right.
Actually an abnormal construct,
That's an
right? That is
abnormal
right. They were never
construct.
meant to be raised
That's
just with 2
not
parents.
how we
They
were
always
raised.
needed all
That's-
kids globally,
that's
right? Not
It's
just here.
It's an African thing, but it ain't just an African
just-
thing. Traditional families have always been extended families, have always been collective. The nuclear family is a byproduct
Of the 50s.
of a capitalist society, a market-driven society, an efficient-based society. And so, to me, it's not surprising when kids don't do well, when we try to force them into this nuclear family construct. And it's not helpful when communities that aren't experiencing what we're experiencing and school people keep wanting to point to the parents, and we're saying, you don't understand our community if you think that's just the issue. So all that
That's
was
right.
to co-sign what you said.
And if we think about the violence issue, this is why, first of all, you guys, and hopefully everybody's listening, realizes we wouldn't have the research on violence if it was a black people problem. That's the straight up honest,
Yeah,
right?
that's
we
right.
have all of the research on violence
They're
and
happy
trauma.
for us to kill
right,
each other.
Right. We have all of the research on violence and trauma because of the impact on white people.
Yeah.
And so the stuff that comes out around families and what helps heal kids actually comes from what we know about the nuclear family ain't working for white people either. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm not
No,
being
it's true.
completely.
No. Yeah.
And that we know that, right, that boys, outcomes for boys across the continuum are negative, right? Boys across the globe
Yeah.
aren't doing well
Yeah.
because they're not getting what they need, and what they need is a lot of the things I was talking about.
Yes,
That's
those
across-
assets.
Those assets.
And one important thing that you're saying, we must say again, the asset of having 2 or more adults in a young person's life besides their parents. History, research tells us that that's a protective factor.
That's right.
Now, we are so pleased to have, you know this is about
Go ahead and
right.
keep on
That's
talking
right.
about.
So-
we can talk about what I want to talk about at another
Yeah,
time
no,
because
but
this,
you're
this is
here.
real important.
Yeah, so-
Even though I know you were making a light of the fact that they are happy for us to see us killing
Of
each other.
course,
You know
I'm
that. You know
tongue in
that
cheek.
is just.
But we've
tongue in
got
cheek.
Patricia Avery was in her car and gave a call over the break and said, "I'm coming over.
Yes.
I want to get in on this conversation."
Well,
So jump in, baby.
Well, I know we don't have a lot of time, Imani, but I was thinking about how coming from a traumatized community, and we're actively seeing a lot of violence that we normally see, especially when it heats up. We start to see more and more violence in our community, and I have to thank you all for getting this word out and the message out about how important it is for us just to be aware of what some of these systematic problems, the root causes to some of these violent behaviors might be coming from. What I was actually thinking about, why aren't we talking about the systems that perpetrate the trauma
Right.
onto the communities? And when I say that, you talked about best practices earlier, which is something that we certainly need to look at. But why aren't our systems looking, the larger system, and I'm particularly talking about the criminal justice
Absolutely.
system, why aren't they looking at ways in which they can help the community in relieving some of this trauma?
We have to call for it. So on this show, we've talked about trying to access culturally competent mental health services for kids and families, even communities.
Yes.
But that still won't solve it,
That's
right?
not going to solve
if
it.
the root cause of it is systems violence,
It's
right?
systems.
Is policies, political violence. So
Yes.
we have to talk about it on all these levels: the personal, the collective, and the societal practices. And so you are the president of our local branch of the NAACP who wants to be clear this doesn't just become another victim blaming conversation,
Absolutely.
right? How can we change black people? How can we change young
That's right.
people? Because that would solve the problem. I want to say that I believe Access categorically rejects that idea that the answer is just to change black people.
That's right.
So actually, to think
yes.
about it, I like to think about it as a metaphor of like spinning plates. So when we first got
Yes.
funded, it's around changing things on multiple levels simultaneously. So we're again, best practice involves both improving communities, improving parents, having employment policies,
That's
having positive recreation, having interventions, having neighborhood policies that promote mixed income
And
lighting,
not criminalizing
Yes.
those individuals
That's right.
who have
So,
mental
right,
illnesses.
so you get
and
how
so
broad. Yeah, that's right.
my whole thing is we started to talk about this whole notion of a mental health court.
That's right.
Yes.
And so if you talk about alternatives to incarceration and not recriminalizing people who have mental illnesses, why aren't we talking about having a real conversation about a mental health court?
I really want to push that, babe. I mean, I don't think it would be, I think it's something that Access obviously supports.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the reasons that this show exists, is to be an arm that speaks in public to say, this is what we believe in, this is what we care about. I know you take this position, and I know the branch does. Do we have any ammunition from the local or national NAACP to help us grab onto something to push this in our community?
You know, I certainly believe that that is an area where we can be of a lot of assistance.
I think so, yeah.
In terms of when we talk about mass incarcerations, you know, we're right there in terms of rolling back the clock on
Yes.
how we just throw away the key on so many people. And many times, a lot of those individuals that are in the court system or in the criminal justice system are there with mental health.
They have mental health
Needs.
issues. They have
mental health needs.
They're very underexposed to the world.
That's right.
And there is a hugely disproportionate gap between the education level of those who are incarcerated versus
And the
those
poverty.
of us who
You
are.
talked about
Absolutely.
And can we, you know, when we started off, I sort of came in talking about my rant about
Yeah.
fathers, and so
Yeah.
I kind of, I know we're going to wind up, but I want to go back to thinking about the economic impact of incarcerating so many men,
Absolutely.
most of whom are fathers, men and women, and what that does to communities. Because I believe that, right? So I wish policymakers who want to know, what do we do to reduce gun violence? What do we do? Remember, I talked about
Yep.
how important it is to have men who are available. So we talk about mental health in court and interventions and restorative practices and keeping men at home. To me, that's key to healing communities. Because
That's
if you
right.
don't have men
That's
there to be doing the modeling, the behavior correction, the course correction, the providing and protect, no community is safe when its men are out of the community. And so I wish a policymaker, right, would realize that a community is always going to be vulnerable when you remove its economic base. Right, wrong, and
Absolutely.
different. Men always make more money than women.
Absolutely.
And men and women together, right, collectively, regardless of sexual orientation, always
right.
bring in more money
Absolutely,
together. So the
Absolutely.
key viability of a community is keeping your men at home.
Well,
right, and I
and-
wish policymakers
So,
would really see
Carrie,
that
can
as
I-
key.
We have to. It gets back to the economics.
That's right.
Of
The
course,
economics
of
and,
course.
and what
And that's what
Martell
I
was talking
hear.
about earlier.
And when I'm out in the community in Garden Hills talking to folks, it always comes back to economics. It always comes back to the job. Well, listen,
But as a city, we got to make a not as a city, as a people who live in the United
Yes.
States, we're gonna have to decide that we believe that everybody who wants a job can get a job.
That's right. Full
so we have to
employment.
right, we have to go full employment. And I don't know, right, I don't think people realize that how important it is to have
Well,
a collective
well,
will that we need a full
but
employment
who
policy.
says
right?
who says
well, in
we
February
can't call
there
for it?
there were over 250 individuals that came to
Yes.
Douglas Center looking for employment.
Yes.
So the idea that no one's out there looking for
No,
work.
I said,
No,
but as
no.
a community, we need
We have
need
to
a-
decide those are legitimate.
Yeah,
Yes.
that everybody who wants
Okay,
a job
we
should
have
have a
to.
job.
We've
Does
got
that
to
make
wrap
sense?
up for
Absolutely.
today. We're going to pick this back up next week. And remember, Access is a collective of organizations and agencies. So one of the things we're going to pick up on, who are the Access members that get us closer to these more global policy questions? Because the courts, juvenile justice, etc., they're partnering with the Access Initiative. So this isn't always about, Karen, can you find me 3 mental health professionals to come on the show? It's also about the policymakers who are partners to Access stepping up and answering these more global questions. So with that in mind, we've got to go.
'Cause you know.
Work on our happiness, work on our togetherness, keep holding hands. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Access Live. Access Initiative is a trauma and justice-informed system of care. We're glad that you joined us today. Please join us every Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. for Access Live. Thank you and be well.